If you spend even 5 minutes looking at the news today, it really feels like society is just completely tearing itself apart. But what if I told you that this massive division we're seeing isn't just political, it's actually a biological glitch, and worse, it's being weaponized by code? Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to decode the exact psychological mechanics and evolutionary glitches that are driving a wedge through society. We'll be unpacking the hard science behind social identity theory and tribalism to show you, step by step, how your brain is quite literally being hijacked.
So, it's the million-dollar question, right? Why is the world so divided? We're constantly slammed with this overwhelming, visceral hostility almost everywhere we look online. But here's the absolute most important thing you need to take away from this right out of the gate. Tribalism is not just some modern political choice. It's actually a universal human glitch. We tend to think all this online hostility is just about modern disagreements, but the truth is deeply, deeply rooted in our biology. It's an ancient mechanism built to keep us safe, but man, in today's digital world, it is doing the exact opposite.
All right, let's get into Section 1, the us versus them brain. To really figure out what's going on here, we kind of have to rewind a bit. Our modern digital hostility actually stems from an ancient evolutionary survival trick we inherited from our hunter-gatherer ancestors. Think about it. Back then, your survival depended entirely on the tight-knit group you belonged to. If you weren't part of an us, you definitely wouldn't survive the them. And that perfectly sets up the foundational science here, social identity theory. This was developed by psychologists Henri Tajfel and John Turner back in 1979. Basically, they found that our behavior and our very sense of self are heavily drawn from the social groups we belong to. We naturally find belonging, and we literally build our self-esteem by tossing ourselves into specific communities. It's just how we define who we are.
Because of this, our brains automatically, like almost subconsciously, divide the whole world into an in-group that we fiercely protect and an out-group that we actively push away. The second we identify our in-group, our brains give us a little hit of dopamine for favoring them. But the dark side? We instantly start viewing anyone in the out-group with suspicion. We treat them as a potential threat, almost by default. Which brings us to Section 2, the cognitive bias trap. Now, this natural group separation is tricky enough, but let's raise the stakes a bit. This tendency gets hugely warped by cognitive biases. Basically, these are systematic errors in our judgment, mental shortcuts our brains use to save energy, which unfortunately lead to a totally distorted view of reality. A huge one is the fundamental attribution error, identified by social psychologist Lee Ross in 1977. Here's how it works. When we make a mistake, we blame the situation. Say you snap at a coworker. Well, obviously it's because you didn't sleep well. But when someone else makes a mistake, we blame their inherent personality. If they snap at you, it's because they're just a terrible person. We give ourselves endless grace, but we assume the absolute worst about everyone else.
And this bias scales up in a really dangerous way into what researchers call the group attribution error. This is when we see a single negative action from just one person in the outgroup, and we unfairly stamp that as a fixed personality trait for their entire demographic. If someone in our group does something wrong, it's just a fluke, right? But if someone in their group does it, boom, it's proof that they're all exactly like that. This is literally the exact cognitive trap that fuels stereotyping and rips society apart.
Moving right along to Section 3, echo chambers and algorithms.
So if this were just human nature playing out in tiny ancient villages, we'd probably manage. But we don't live in villages anymore. We live in a hyper-connected digital world where social media platforms literally weaponize these exact cognitive biases just to keep you scrolling. Let's walk through the 3 steps of how you actually descend into a digital echo chamber. Step 1 is selective exposure. You naturally look for info that rewards you by confirming what you already believe. Step 2 is homophilic clustering. You start forming super tight groups with people just like you, and information only circulates inside that bubble. And finally, Step 3, epistemic isolation. You are completely cut off from credible, diverse sources of knowledge. You're perfectly insulated, sure, but you're also totally isolated from the actual truth.
And honestly, here is the truly scary part. You might genuinely think you are actively choosing your digital tribe, but the algorithms are doing all the heavy lifting behind the scenes. These platforms are tracking your clicks, your likes, how long you linger on a post. They know for a fact that outrage, sensationalism, and tribalism trigger massive, immediate emotional reactions. So what do? They prioritize content that makes you furious at the outgroup, specifically to keep you locked tight inside your little homophilic cluster.
And that leads to Section 4, effective polarization.
So what's the real-world result of millions of people trapped in these algorithm-fueled echo chambers? It creates a highly dangerous condition for society, known scientifically as affective polarization. See, it's no longer just about, hey, we disagree on this policy, or I have a different idea for this problem. It has morphed into this deep, visceral, emotional hatred for the other side. You don't just think the outgroup is incorrect anymore. You start to feel like they are inherently evil and a literal threat to your entire way of life.
And the symptoms of affective polarization, they are actively playing out all around us right now. We're seeing intense outgroup prejudice, a totally massive drop in trust toward democratic institutions, and a complete loss of a shared factual narrative. Different groups can't even agree on basic reality anymore. Plus, maybe most dangerously, it leads to crazy levels of social conformity and groupthink. The fear of being rejected by our own in-group gets so strong that we'll actively ignore a better idea just to avoid being kicked out of our tribe.
Now, get ready for a major aha moment. A 2021 study published in the American Political Science Review looked at British adults and found something wild. Simply putting people into a politically homogeneous group, meaning everyone in the room already agrees with each other, and having them discuss an issue like immigration actually raised their affective polarization and outgroup animosity by 5 whole points on a thermometer scale. Think about that for a second. Just talking to people who already agree with you makes you hate the other side more. Let that sink in.
All right, let's talk solutions. Section 5, breaking the cycle. So we know the biology, we know what the algorithms are doing, and we can clearly see the mess it's causing. How on earth do we escape? Well, the empirical antidote, which was demonstrated in a major 2021 study by Fishkin and his colleagues, is surprisingly simple in theory, even if it feels tough to do. They found that cross-partisan discussions and heterogeneous networks, which basically just means mixing up groups and talking across partisan lines, highly effectively reduce both policy and affective polarization. When you force that echo chamber open and let different voices in, the animosity actually begins to dissolve.
The environments we put ourselves in matter so much. Homogeneous groups just increase hostility by constantly reinforcing that us versus them narrative. But heterogeneous groups? They actively build empathy through a psychological process called perspective taking. When you actually sit down and interact with members of the outgroup, it triggers your brain to see their shared humanity. You start understanding their hopes, their fears, and those rigid stereotypes you were holding on to, they begin to shatter. It literally rewires your brain to reduce prejudice.
There's this fantastic quote from the philosopher Albert G. Hubbard that just perfectly summarizes decades of psychological research on intergroup contact. He wrote, "If men could only know each other, they would never idolize nor hate." I mean, that hits the nail right on the head, doesn't it? When we actually use our minds to understand someone else's perspective, we drop the black and white thinking entirely. We stop treating our own side like flawless gods, and we finally stop treating the other side like irredeemable monsters. I want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on today. As you're scrolling through your feeds later, reading the news, or just chatting with friends, ask yourself, are you truly choosing your digital tribes? Or is a line of code choosing them for you? I challenge you to really evaluate your own echo chambers. Recognize that us versus them narrative when it's being spoon-fed to you, and take the active step to seek out a totally different perspective. Because honestly, that is exactly how we start to fix the glitch. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning what you consume.